I'm going to start recording. I'm going to do the thing and I'll let you know. Okay, let's do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, hang on a second. Starting, going live. Okay, so, hello everyone. This is Emacs 29, and today I am here with Prot and Philip Kaludercic. Because we're having this conversation about Emacs newcomer experience, which started off with a Emacs Carnival last month about the newbies and starter kits, which Sen had started and you fleshed out with more questions. And now this is snowballing to, okay, let's figure out what we can do to make Emacs easier for newbies who are coming in. You know, maybe they're non-developers who have heard good things about org mode, or maybe they're developers who want to try out, you know, what this Emacs thing is and what's all the fuss about for having an editor that's been around for so long. Or maybe they're actually like still VS Code or Vim fans, but they really just want to use Magit, so they're coming in just for that. A lot of different paths to coming into Emacs. So we do have this live stream, so if people have questions, I will at some point figure out where the chat is on my screen so I can read them out to you. But if my plan here is I'll just be in the background taking notes most of the time and interjecting with occasional question, and maybe Philip and Prot, you can go brain dump all the wonderful things you've been thinking about the Emacs newcomer experience.
At this point, regret not having written down any notes from the last video or from your last recording of YouTube, because I noticed I had a few things I wanted to add or intersperse. But I guess we can take a look at two things. So first one is the state of introducing people to Emacs now. And the question there is, who are we introducing Emacs to? Just like you said, you sketched out a few different profiles of people who presumably have entirely different interests, motivations, why they like if someone wants to just use Magit, like Emacs is the tool, is the GUI that implements Magit, then these people have an entirely different motivation than someone who actually says, well, I'm coming at it from, I heard it's an interesting tool for free software development and to build your own, or like understand free software in a different sense, where you can actually do find function and open the definition of the function you just use. And this, I think, malleable is the current catchword that people like to use in that context. So there's some issue in that sense. And then I think the specific comment from the last discussion which caught my attention was, we were talking about the Emacs 31, there's this preset theme, the newcomers preset theme, which is implemented as a user option theme, or that's how I like to refer to it. And I probably should just briefly stop and say that everything I'm saying is from my own perspective. That I'm not, I don't feel comfortable saying that this is the Emacs level perspective, or that any other of the Emacs developers necessarily have to agree with me. I just think that I might have a few things.
Sorry, I lost your audio. Just to say, I lost your audio, Philip.
Excuse me?
I lost your audio for a second. You were saying you could hear it fine. Okay. So I will hear the recording. Yeah.
Okay, so basically,
okay, I hope
you can repeat it, I guess. Go ahead.
What did I say?
So you were saying that
I'm not representing Emacs Devil. These are my views, which are informed by the discussions that we had on Emacs Devil, that I hope to that will be representative. So I think I'm the maintainer of the preset theme, but of course other people are also contributing to it and adding other options. The specific point I had, like the target audience of the preset theme, was not people who would be particularly interested in what the options are. I think that was a discussion point last time, that I admit it's a technical deficiency currently, that you can't, there's no pretty way. Like I think it would be nice if we extended the scribe theme to actually list the options that are modified with hyperlinks, so that you could look into these options. That's currently not there. We didn't add it in time for the feature cut for Emacs 31, but I think for Emacs 32 that's going to be an interesting feature to have at some point. And and actually the idea had been floating around. I think like every time there's a periodical discussions, like how should we make Emacs more user-friendly on Emacs level, and people say we have to, like, let's say the extremist position is, what do you mean not user-friendly? It's perfect the way it is. It's God-given configuration. And the other people who say, well, why don't we just install Doom Emacs and make that the default then? And somewhere in between, I think there's a reasonable position to be had. But in these discussions, one of the reasons this came, I participated maybe in like 4 or 5 of them, and then this point came up. Why don't we have a theme, like a collection of user options which you can toggle in one switch, which enable all the options from which we would not find, which existing users would not find interesting, which are always the bulk of the users. Most people are already existing users. They don't come in. And one of the things, lots of existing users, I'm thinking of like a 60-year-old professor who has been using Emacs for 30 years, or a software engineer who's using it and maybe consciously or unconsciously appreciates the fact that it doesn't change every few years. You don't have a graphic designer, like this is of course mean against graphic designers and UI designers who have a needs to reinvent the UI interface every few years, and then things change. And how do I save now? What's the button to do this? And the UI changes. There are people who value the stability, but of course the common conventions have grown apart. What Emacs does and what people are used to from other programs. Now, in this point, we also have to distinguish that there are things which Emacs doesn't do the way other programs do, which I would argue are actually sensible. Which are, for example, I think one issue I remember was when I first started using Emacs, I had a terminal emulator. I wanted to have a terminal emulator within Emacs. And nowadays, I use eshell, which to me seems like a more truer Emacs experience. This is a strong opinion maybe. And it's also influenced by a history of using Plan 9 and that kind of terminal, where actually the output is just as editable. You can just search it, you can edit it, you can cut it, you can interact with the output any way you would use a normal text, which is not something you can do with a terminal for purely historical reasons. And at my university, the university where I studied computer science, I frequently helped people in the introductory Linux course. And one thing you notice there, these are real newcomers. These are people who have never used Linux or a terminal or anything like that before. The first thing they do when they want to, they use the arrow keys expecting, or they use the mouse and click on the previous prompt. And they want to modify the previous prompt. But of course, that doesn't work because that's not how terminal emulators work. You don't, all the previous output, that's fixed. You don't touch that anymore. Everyone, I guess, even the people who we describe as newcomers when talking about Emacs, obviously know what. Of course, you don't touch the previous prompt in the terminal. And these are some expectations you have if you use Eclipse, if you use VS Code, if you use. I'm not sure how the NeoVim terminal emulator works. I know they have a built-in one. I think Vim also, but I'm guessing right now.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some accumulated intuitions which Emacs actually intentionally doesn't want to give in all purposes, because I'd argue that one of the strengths of Emacs is really having this uniform text interface, where I can use iSearch, I can use occur, I can use the highlighting commands. I can just select a region and write it out to a buffer and stuff like that. The shell buffer is no different than anything else in that respect. And trying to please interrupt me, by the way. This is not supposed to be a monologue.
No. Go ahead.
So it sounds like there's an interesting
and breaking
challenge
some of
here.
these intuitions is legitimate.
Yeah, how do we help people develop the Emacs intuitions?
To some degree, it really feels like it has to be something that you immerse yourself in. The issue, I guess, is, or I knew people who actually used Emacs, and when you can help them in a face-to-face setting, or like Prot does in his teaching settings, then you communicate certain things which I don't want to say they're ineffable. You can't really. It's not like you couldn't write them down in a manual, but it's also like the mentality that people have. A different example I have, like I remember I was using dabbrev for the first time or something. For a while, I was irritated that there was no undo. Like, how do I go back to the previous text expansion? Until at some point I realized, oh wait, it's just regular undo. Just this. That's just the way you undo it. But somehow writing this down in a manual is it's not an easy thing to always think of these things. Like for me, it seems obvious now, but at that point, I specifically remember it was unintuitive. I had this context, this accumulated expectation from other programs. But if I have a text expansion in this case, that I'm actually cycling through some special sort of menu, not thinking of it as just regular text buffer operations, just text editing in some fancy way. So that's one thing I think we should keep in mind. This was all related to the preset theme in some way, right?
Yes.
You're writing this down.
Yes, I'm writing this down. That's why we have notes. So what I'm thinking is you wanted, the idea behind the newcomers presets is to kind of smooth over some of those intuition disrupting things where people are coming in with maybe expectations of how stuff should work in a modern editor.
But specifically the intuition. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Specifically the intuition disrupting things which are not necessary in some sense. Like we wouldn't want to be an intuition disrupt. Like you could probably like Kua mode or something. That would be something where people, if they would start using, if we would enable Kua mode by default, that would inhibit further development, because then it might be confusing with using Control-C, like because suddenly delay becomes a user input, which is usually not the case with Emacs. I know it's which key is an exception in that case, because actually with which key pausing actually is an action and displays the pop-up buffer. And we do enable which key due to popular request in the preset theme. So I personally was a bit hesitant about that one, but it seems to be something where you have to like really weigh it on a case-to-case basis. But Sacha, do you have what version of Emacs do you have running there? I can't make it out.
This is Emacs 31. So I do have.
So you can open the preset theme, right?
Yeah. Hang on a second. Let me bring up I have now a terminal, so I can. Hang on a second. Let me bring up a completely fresh Emacs.
No, I just wanted to open the file.
Oh,
because in the file there is the prelude, there's a commentary section that actually explains it's a library. That's exactly the joke with the.
Yeah, that's part of the problem with those themes. Yeah,
the problem.
Wait,
themes are not libraries.
It would be easier if they were all there. Like, it's a kind of an implementation detail that, from a user, it doesn't really make a difference.
All right.
You have the same problem with modal themes, right? If I remember correctly.
All right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you see up there the commentary section?
Yeah.
If you scroll up a bit, it's above line 37. These the theme configures which we can reasonably expect the average user to want to enable, but would otherwise be unlikely to discover on their own. That's sort of the overall guide of what options we want to add. It's not. That's why it's also an option on the splash screen. You just tick it, and then the user options enabled in theme should be activated by default.
I was trying to figure out.
That's sort of the idea.
So it is available on the splash screen. So if I say display splash, oh my goodness, how do I get to the splash screen?
It's Control-H, Control-A or not? I forgot. Control-H-A maybe?
There's a splash screen and there's the...
Hang on a second, I'm just going to start a new
Yeah, I haven't done that in, like, I don't know.
That's the About Emacs screen. But you have display
Control-H, Control-A on mine.
No, those
about
are two
Emacs, Emacs about Emacs.
No, I have a better idea. I'm going to start this new Emacs person. Okay, here we go. New Emacs. Fresh person. So we click on this, right? And it turns on a bunch of things, including the tab bar. I wasn't entirely sure how people would save that so that it happens again next time. Is the idea that they just keep checking that box?
That's not done currently. That's something we haven't simply decided on. The current presentation is you enable it in that mode, and then you'd have to, which is of course saying it out loud makes it sound stupid, but you'd have to persistently save the themes.
Okay.
So then I think it's
fine.
option save themes, and then
Yeah, I mean, it is
you
possible for
persist
people
the
to
save.
get to it if we like leave them a
Yeah,
breadcrumb
of course,
that
but
tells
that's
them. Yeah, but they're not. It's not going to occur to them because it would never occur to them to say customize Emacs custom themes, and then I can pick newcomers themes
yeah.
from here, and then.
No,
So,
that's
okay.
it's a point that we actually, that I at least intended to mention at some point
All right.
on Emacs level, whether we want to make this, because currently it just loads a theme, but it doesn't persist the choice. But it could
Okay.
just as well persist the choice. There's a discussion to be had which of these two behaviors is more intuitive, because of course if you persist the option, then you have the disadvantage that someone might enable it but doesn't actually want it, but now somehow their Emacs is worked from their perspective. I don't want tabs or whatever they say, or I don't want which key, and then they don't know how to disable it. So this is I wouldn't say it's an obvious decision in either direction.
Yeah. Like if there is an enable button or save, there should be a disable and unsave, like remove.
Yeah, but that's the checkbox idea in that case.
So that would be the tricky part.
And especially finding the place on the splash screen so that this actually works for everyone. Because if you open it in a TUI mode, I think then initially, if I remember correctly, we had this button or this new to Emacs line was underneath the copyrights. No, that was a different thing. If you click on newcomers-presets, for example, then you are redirected to the manual entry. And I think we had some, there's the top line. If you got here by clicking the link on the splash screen, that was on the bottom. That was on the bottom of the manual entry. But if you open it up in a 80x24 terminal, you wouldn't see this line.
You can't see it, and you don't know how to. Yeah, you don't know how to. You don't know.
And then
how to scroll
these are the complications that you have to keep in mind in that case. Yeah, you don't know how to. You might not have the intuition that space to scroll, which I think that's like the case in less. But yes, then again, you have this accumulated intuition from using Unix tools, which is one of the points I wanted to bring up. Who is this mythical newcomer? What's their actual background? Because I claim now this might be controversial that if someone's actually new to using computers at all, which is something I have seen, like people who have never programmed, people who have never used Unix, people who have never used more than a web browser, to exaggerate. They appear to do fine with Emacs because they have no expectation of using Control-C, Control-V, Control-C, and so on. They know that they have to use the buttons up there. So in that sense, they're fine. There's an optimization loop when you use Control, when you use these shortcuts and a few of these conventions, how to move around. That's Emacs defaults appear to be inconvenience. So that's also a distinction you have to make in that setting.
Exactly. Plus, you cannot optimize for everybody. Eventually, you just have to make some assumptions.
Exactly. But what these assumptions are is the controversial.
Correct. No, I think the way you approached it makes sense. Like this is the reasonable way, I think, to do it. You have to assume that they have this background knowledge. And if they don't, it's what you said, like they don't have to relearn something because they didn't know it to begin with. So they start from a good basis.
Is there interest in having some kind of focus group or something like that, so that if we come across newbies, we can say, hey, the developers would like to be able to float some questions once in a while to see what actual newbies would think of this?
I have actually tried this in one set, like I was in a hacker.
Oh yeah.
What's it called? There's this Chaos Computer Club in Germany, and they have like local events on a regular basis. And I was going to one anyway because a few friends of mine were going there, and then I did an introduction to Emacs course there and printed out a survey, basically a questionnaire for Emacs neophytes. I think if you search for that string on the Emacs development list, you're going to find that. And I gave a few people these text, like I printed it out. It was actually pieces of paper, so it wouldn't be personally identified, or there wouldn't be any information there. And one of the things I thought was interesting in the results was that the main thing people were saying was it's overwhelming. Like the amount of things, like just the default Emacs, no configuration, no options, no auto completion, no what's it called, no FIDO, whatever. It was just so many new things, so many differences that they lost an overview basically. This was a group of people who I think there were questions in there like, how long have you been using computers? Because of course it was sort of generic. What previous UIs have you had experience with? And most people like use Eclipse or VI, NeoVim, and even reasonably complex Vim configurations. Of course, this is a bias due to the setting in which I was asking these questions. And I'm actually planning to repeat this experiment because I'm going to another one of these congresses or these meetups in a month or so. I wanted to offer this again to people, specifically seeing if these newcomer presets are valuable, or if they help people or not. But of course, doing this in a properly scientific setting would be much more difficult. Like,
yeah, of course.
You need money, difficult steps
but
doing that.
Maybe even like a mailing list, we can say, hey, you're new to Emacs, but you kind of want to make it better. Email this person, and every so often when developers have a question, they can say like, does this make sense to you? Here's a screenshot, or would you prefer this versus this?
As in, we would send an email to all the people, but then I mean, the big question, difficulty in that sense is then data protection. I think that's what I was trying to avoid with having this just printed out and no personal authentication. Because then we have to store email addresses.
Okay, all right, that's fine. That's fair.
Within a European context. So sounds like an excuse. Partially it is, but something like, I mean. Then there's of course also, I'm not saying that my approach, what I was doing was unbiased. But there are people who would be more willing to answer these things and people who are less willing. Like I know the bias in this case because I actually saw the people and I had a feeling for what kind of people they were. So I think I'm in a better position to factor it out. But if it's actually properly, like if you just have people who you send emails to, I'm not sure how. If it remains representative, because there have been these Emacs surveys in the past. I remember at least 2 generations, and they're of course the ones which are circulated on Reddit, on Hacker News, on IRC, which I still think is a bubble of maybe 200 people, like mainly 200 people, and some people around and people who are surrounding these groups. So I'm always sort of dubious because these are the people. I mean, these are people who are much more likely to have heard of what's it called, evil mode or something like that, or have some experience with other editors, and these things all influence their responses, and I'm always taints the results every time these discussions are brought up on Emacs level. People have some level of doubt as to how reliable the results are.
Correct. It's hard to get reliable results, though some data is still better than nothing. But granted, you don't want to base decisions on those results, of course not.
Yeah, that shouldn't be the last, that shouldn't be a decision-making factor. You should just have a function where the input is whatever the data is, and then the output is mechanically determined by that. Yes. Now, related to the preset theme, there's also been a discussion, and I don't think this has been mentioned much online, of so-called reset themes. I'm not sure if you've heard of these. So the idea would be, additionally to having preset themes of options which we have changed, which we would recommend, because the preset theme, the newcomer preset theme, makes no real assumption that the options will stay stable. So we might change them from version to version. This gives us some flexibility to say we have a new option, like for example, if the preset theme had existed since Emacs 29, and now in Emacs, that was actually the reason this entire discussion started. In Emacs 31, that's the current release, to be released, there's this package-autosuggest-mode. So that's a little prompt when it's enabled, a little prompt in the mode line. When you can click on it, that Emacs installs the package which it believes to be the right one for the current
the major mode,
for the current file you're editing. No, it's a minor mode. It's a global minor mode.
No, I mean, but it installs based on the major mode, right?
Yes. It installs a major mode package, which matches the current file format being used based on auto mode A list or the magic magic file A list and all these things, and it can inform these things. And we didn't want to enable this by default, but we wanted to enable it for newcomers. So that was actually the first option in the presets, in the newcomers preset. And if the preset had been older, we would have still wanted to add this to the preset theme. It's not supposed to be set in stone. Now, the idea with the reset theme is, and this is still hypothetical since we haven't implemented it, is to have reset themes for specific Emacs versions. So Emacs 32, we might have an Emacs 31 reset theme for all the options that we have changed in Emacs 31, in Emacs 32, so that we could reset them to the previous option. So that in this sense too, if the question is really just, we don't want to annoy people who have, when upgrading, of course, it's still a minor inconvenience because they have to write load theme Emacs 31 reset in their configuration, but it would be easier for them to actually undo any changes. And in future versions of Emacs, hopefully also persist these changes so that you can really sort of like pinning your version of Emacs, soft pinning of options. So this is something for the future. Consider as well, which would be reusing the theme approach, which is another reason why I hope that the notion of user option themes will become more, because it's been there from the beginning. This the customized system has always supported user options to be added, but people have always only customized, or not only, I'm not sure if no one has never done it, but it has not been a popular approach to use the user options, even though the technical facilities have been there all the time. And that's also going to be interesting if the reset theme will be forwards compatible, but that's another discussion that makes it all even more complicated. So that you could add them hypothetically to ELPA as a core package.
Nice. Yeah. Of course, the reset themes, if you implement them, that's great because it opens up the possibility to be a little bit more ambitious with the defaults and break.
Yeah. Because that's every core, every defaults discussion boils down to, if we break this, people won't understand what changed. If we change this, then people won't understand what broke. But on the other side, people like all new, can we reasonably assume that all new people would actually want this theme? Then we want to give us some sort of more flexibility in this sense without actually the support, because I think that the value proposition of having a stable interface where you can expect the appearance of the theme to be somewhat stable over time, how Emacs behaves, that's actually a positive thing to have. And finally, in Emacs 32, this is also finally, for now, one thing I just thought, which I was reminded of, there's a big plan for Emacs 31. This is one of I've never pronounced his name, Sean Whitten, I think it should be pronounced. He said that one of his plans as a maintainer will be to work on the bundled version of Emacs, which some people, including myself, have been calling Fat Emacs. So selecting certain packages from ELPA, from GNU ELPA, and having a secondary distribution of Emacs, which would include additional packages, which are currently. So for example, one example would be Orgtech. And then you could, when you install Emacs, you could install, I don't know, Big or Fat or whatever, Big Emacs with all these packages pre-installed, which would be pinned to the right version, which we would have hopefully ensure that they're actually compatible with one another. And then you have the normal Emacs, which would be the thinner one. And an interesting corollary of all of this would also be that if the way from ELPA into the core would be made easier, that the way out of the core into ELPA would also be made easier. Because that would mean it's more easier to deprecate packages over time, since you can install, this protective layer, let's say, protected merely by inconvenience and the annoyance of moving these packages in and out would fade away over time. That some cruft within Emacs itself, within core Emacs, could be moved to ELPA, so we could actually thin down Emacs. That's one possibility.
Oh, that's big.
One strain of commentary in that direction. That's something that I'm planning to help on in the Emacs 32 development cycle. Because these options then could also be, and any options related to this could also be added to the the newcomers preset theme. So one could, of course, Vertigo or these interactive selection packages. I think I've commented on that before. There is a certain controversy there that I think that there is a certain controversy that selection is not always the same as text expansion, which is sometimes like there are, I think the certain skeletons or there's this insert, what's it called? Auto insert command. It's not auto insert command, it's something like that. That prompts the user for multiple things, but it's not written using read multiple completions, but it's written in a way that there's a manual loop which waits for an empty input to occur. But if you're using Vertigo or Fido, there's by default, if you just press enter, you don't actually have an empty input, but you just select the default option. And there's settings like these, where these two kinds of completion diverge from one another, which is also something I've been talking about for a few years, but never came around to implementing, that there should be an API distinction between actually selecting user options from a list and the completion interface, which we have for files or commands currently. These are semantically two different things, which would be interesting it would be interesting to see if it would be worth distinguishing the two in a technical sense. Because that would mean that in certain settings, we could enable Fido. And I totally admit that Fido and Vertigo have their advantages when it comes to discoverability over standard text completion. But, compromise now was that in Emacs 31, there's this option. I think it's eager completion updating or something. It's a combination, it's a permutation of these words in some sense. So that if the completions buffer pops up in Emacs, no, you don't have the. I thought it doesn't matter. You don't have to visualize it. But
where they update as you type.
Updates as you type. But that doesn't occur down there. But it only occurs in the completions buffer. That's sort of be the compromise. That's Fido, right?
That's it. But the completions, the generic completions, has had a lot of improvements over the last few years. Yeah. And in Emacs 31, it's in a very good state, all things considered.
Which was also partially driven by your MCT package?
MCT, which was an experiment, of course, but it's basically that idea. Exactly, because I have used this in earnest, like the default, like this, I have used it for a long time in earnest, like just defaults. It's very good. It's for sure very good. Whereas Fido and Vertigo are better if you are just getting started and you don't know that there is a completions and the mini buffer, and somehow there is a distinction between the two. Like for somebody who is getting started, especially, I think this interface is not good. But if you know what you are doing, I think this interface actually works perfectly. Like it has and it has a lot of options. So Sacha, what you are showing there is the absolute default, but it has so many options that you can make it look actually quite different from this, and very similar to Vertigo, for example, in terms of the user experience.
I just realized
one additional thing.
Oh, I just realized
just to add to this,
tab. If you do the tab, it now goes to that one, which is great, but you can't filter it from there. You can't type into it and have stuff happen. So.
Yeah, it's not down there. If you're down there
in
the mini buffer, you type. Exactly. That's not that up there. You're just a regular text buffer, so you could search or you could select stuff out of there.
And that's also an option, by the way. So what happens on the second tab, for example? So you can configure that.
Right. So that was the second tab behavior from Newcomer presets.
Exactly. That's the option I propose and no one objected to.
Yes. Work in progress. So basically, you have these newcomers. We're trying to figure out how to get them to, through their learning journey. The newcomer presets can smooth over some of the edges. It can get over that. Yes, there are a lot of options, but at least MetaX with a tab completion will show you the things so that you don't have to memorize the names as much. You can recognize them from the list. You can narrow it down.
The behavior is supposed to actually be similar to Bash.
Yeah.
The way Bash says
completion. It's probably still we're going to need them to read the tutorial, and we're going to need them use a lot of patience as they get used to Emacs. I am not quite sure yet if we can get them all the way to, all right, here's how you open your config file and define your own keyboard shortcuts, for example. Bit of a journey.
Yeah. That's
I think that one way to do that is to have more examples in the manual. Like, here is how you do this, here is how you do that.
or in there's this other manual, the Emacs FAQ.
I don't mind where it would be. Like, FAQ is totally fine. I don't mind exactly where it would be, but somewhere in the documentation, like common patterns of Emacs configuration kind of thing. Maybe it already exists, so if it exists, then of course even better. Yeah.
Emacs FAQ has some things on
nice.
finding relating packages, common requests, bug reports. But maybe it was. I remember there's something because I linked to it.
Where is the FAQ? Where is the FAQ?
It's a separate manual.
It's a separate manual.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's a separate manual. You have the ELIS, you have FAQ, and you Emacs manual.
FAQ.
Then
Ooh,
you
okay.
have it.
Yeah, and
Okay.
do you have it from? We do not have it from here, not from the splash screen, but it is available from the help menu.
Yeah. Yes.
Exactly.
And what's the shortcut for it? Okay.
I think it's not been that thoroughly maintained.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you've actually been reading Emacs Devel. Has there already been a long discussion about whether a metax visit user init file makes sense? Like an interactive command that you can use to open. Yeah, I was trying to find it, but even with Yetil's search, I was like, there are 4 threads. One of them was a long time ago, and the other one was from even longer than that. So I didn't know whether it was like some other discussion. Okay.
I don't recall any such discussion recently, but I also don't think that any objection to it. So if it's really just a matter of someone writing it down and adding the documentation,
I would
then
like to
it
do
would
that.
be
Then.
quite likely applied within the next 24 hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
But on the master branch and not Emacs 31 branch, which would be slightly.
It's fine.
Yeah, but even having a button on.
If it makes it in someday, it doesn't have to be in the splash screen. It just has to start off being available through maybe a menu item and a metax command.
You could link to from or mention.
And then we don't have to keep telling people, oh yeah, do a describe variable on the init file just in case, your init file is actually .emacs instead of the .emacs.d/init.el that other people are telling to use instead. It's a bit of a mess, right?
I think some people have been recommending doing meta:, and then calling the visit file function with the user init.
Yeah.
What's the name of the variable again? I don't remember.
User init file.
User Emacs file, I think.
Here we go. User init file. Here we go. That's the thing. So
yeah, exactly.
Sure.
And if you do meta:, find file, user init file, then it would basically do the same thing. That's why I'm saying it's such a minor function that I don't expect any objections.
Okay. So I'm going to suggest that to Emacs Devel at some point.
I've had the same idea many times myself, but the transience of memory has thrown it away before I actually ended up doing it.
Sometimes I am reluctant to suggest things because I figure Emacs has such a long history. It's probably someone has thought of this already, and it's probably been discussed and bike shedded. But I think there are little things.
Yeah,
that
but then in that case. Yeah, but I think that's actually related to another thing I wanted to talk about. There's a certain sort of reverence that people have for Emacs because it's such a historical project. But I mean, the preset theme was something that was discussed for many times, and there were basically no one said, no, we shouldn't do this. This is a bad idea. I hope it's not only because I propose it or something, or like the package-autosuggest stuff. Most of the things I've been working on for Emacs 31, no one objected to, and there are two sides to this. There's some people who actually go overboard with this and try and reinvent, like when reviewing packages, you see this a lot of people try and reinvent functionality, which is basically just giving a new name, combining two things and giving it a new name, which isn't always necessary, but might be useful. And then it's some discussion like, can we actually make more out of this? And that's a different thing. But then there's the people who I probably lean more towards that side when I think to myself, the way I'm doing this is stupid, or this is not as efficient. People have been using Emacs for 40 years. Of course, there probably has to be a better way to do this. And sometimes it turns out it simply hasn't been implemented, and no one has simply done this partially small effort of preparing a patch and ironing out the details. Just some people don't like discussions, of course, and it's understandable. But you can, I mean, there's really no harm in sending a patch and then saying, I'm sorry, I don't have, I mean, it's annoying, of course, from a maintainer's perspective, and I don't recommend doing it. But if you prepare a patch but don't have the time to finish it up, then if it's a useful thing and you actually get someone to be interested in maintaining it, then or bringing the patch to completion, then it's well worth just sending a feature. Even sending a feature request, you don't even have to prepare a patch. Of course, the more work you put in initially, the higher it's going to be that someone's actually going to implement this. I'm just mentioning the idea of a Emacs 31 reset theme is not going to be enough for it actually to occur, to happen. Just like I said, I mentioned the idea of this preset theme many times in the past, but it never actually happened until I sat down for an hour and prepared the file and wrote down the patch. And that's sort of, I wish people would be more conscious of this mentality, but I totally understand people who think otherwise, because when the first time I sent a patch to a mailing list, I don't want to say I was sweating, but I was really nervous because, oh no, what if they insult me, or they say, you fool, you didn't format the patch properly. Don't you know the secret handshake you have to do every time you send a patch? Be gone, whatever. But which is of course not the case. Not to say that there are no unpleasant people on mailing lists, but I think that there is, especially GNU kind communication guidelines, which are supposed to give some sort of goodwill, good faith, attention to how people should behave on mailing lists, how they should treat each other. That's lots of these preconceptions turn out to be false, and that's why I also wanted to participate in this, so that people see, oh, the people maintaining Emacs aren't wizards locked up in a tower, but just, I hope, normal people who happen to spend more time with Emacs, which is
that's a very good point. Yeah,
are valuable, like these discussions.
And I think, Philip, just to add to this, your example of leading with a patch, I think, is also key here for someone who can write a patch, of course, because it cuts out a lot of that noise, that initial discussion of, well, maybe yes, maybe no, because it frames minds. It focuses the attention on something concrete, and that can also help. Yeah.
And I mean, having a patch is useful, but getting someone interested is also helpful. Like the discussion when we merged which key, I helped with that process, and I think it was, I don't remember his last name, Jeremy, who actually did most of the work, and I was reviewing his patches. I was helping along, but I wasn't actually writing most of the code. I was just going over the proposals and helping along, and basically pushing studying the process whenever it got stuck, so that we actually made the necessary changes for it to get merged. And then I did the last finishing touches of merging, because that was also a fun thing. Every time we like to preserve the Git history of packages we merge upstream, which is probably something we won't be doing in that way when we do the fat Emacs releases. But the entire history of Eglot and the entire history of which key is actually preserved in the Emacs Git repository. So if you open the file, it's not anymore a tree in the computer science sense, but it's actually a proper DAG, because suddenly you have multiple roots of the project which come together with the history preserved. And that's an annoying thing to do with Git, but you can do it. And not everyone knows how to do it, but a few people have the commands written down somewhere or look it up on the mailing list, as I do. Then that goes through, but that's...
so they are wizards after all.
Wizards just reading pre-written down spells. Wizards in form, but then substance.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if some of the starter kits move to using that kind of fat Emacs infrastructure once that's in place, because a lot of times the starter kits are there to package together. Okay, here's a list of the packages that it uses. Here's the configuration that makes them play nice together, and then here's some kind of documentation or videos or a demonstration on how to use it to help people get started.
So I'm curious to see. I mean, when reviewing the options to add to the preset theme, I actually went through a number of these starter kits to see the options they suggested. Selected those out, which seemed reasonable to me. And then, of course, this was discussed and people objected or added other things. But I am curious to see how the starter kits will evolve in the future, because that's also something we should mention. I mean, there is a big problem with the fat Emacs approach, and suddenly you have two versions of Emacs. You can write a package which appears to work fine in fat Emacs, but it depends on a package which is not in the pure Emacs or the core Emacs release. And then that's something we will have to deal with in the future as well.
Yeah, that's a tricky part indeed.
That fragmentation.
Yeah, but another thing relating.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the sort of fragmentation of what core Emacs is, and that's it might be a showstopper. So maybe everything I'm telling you here is just a wish list. It doesn't end up actualizing.
And that fragmentation
of like these.
Yes, the setup is
fragmentation
one of the things.
Of what.
Go ahead.
Because it's not actually really difficult to solve. I mean, if you have a package that depends on something from fat Emacs, you just add it to the package requires line. So you explicitly state the dependency. But if people are sloppy, then they might not notice this immediately.
I think
then you have runtime issues when people install.
It's a little bit more than that, right? So, for example, if you have a newbie asking a question, because they're using a starter kit or in the future a fat Emacs thing with different packages installed and different configuration things that they have not personally set up, and they don't have the experience to know, oh yeah, this is going to be related to that, so I should mention it in the help message. I mean, large starter communities like Doom Emacs and Space Emacs will have their own Discord or mailing list where people can go and ask for help. And so people will say, okay, I think I kind of know which starting point you're coming from because it's the base. But if we're, with the smaller starter kits, they don't even know how to ask for help. And everyone is like, on the regular Emacs communities, there's a lot of back and forth if you want to dig into, okay, what do you have enabled? What is affecting your setup?
Yeah.
Fat Emacs is going to run into that problem.
Which, I mean, to be fair, my understanding currently is that it wouldn't enable any other options. It would just bundle more packages.
I see.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right.
So it would be more of an issue for package authors. Yeah.
It would be, for package authors. The idea is, I mean, I've used Emacs in offline settings where it's like really inconvenient to install additional packages, inconvenient or impossible to install additional packages. And just having more functionality out of the box, which ELPA provides, and you don't have to install additionally, is basically ideal. Because this has been a project which has been ongoing for years. I think this is ever since the conception of ELPA itself, which is precisely the reason why GNU ELPA requires all packages to be signed or to be covered by the copyright assignments, while non-GNU ELPA does not. So that this is possible. It's just that finally it looks like we're starting to move somewhere in that direction. It would be interesting if we actually, if a decision were to be made that we're going to give up on this sort of bundling, what decisions that would make for the legal status of GNU ELPA if we would merge GNU ELPA and non-GNU ELPA together, which is unlikely currently. This is just pure speculation at this point, but it's something that might be a discussion which will be had in the future.
Okay, so it dispenses with a package install part, and so people don't have to worry about, okay, how do I make sure the package archives are set up, and how do I install the packages? All that stuff will be pre-installed. The auto mode
Well, the
illness
package archives.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Package archives wouldn't matter that much since we are just talking about GNU ELPA packages, which are installed by default.
Okay.
It's really just you don't have to install additional packages. You don't need a network connection. You don't need to know about the package existence. It would be registered in the auto mode A list anyway. So if you open a, I don't know, what's a package that you would, some major mode that's on GNU ELPA, which is not in the core.
I think you mentioned Octec earlier. I think that would qualify. I think you mentioned Octec earlier, which is on ELPA, but
Octec,
not in core. Yeah, so
the tricky thing there is that Emacs already has a LaTeX mode by default, and that already applies, but Octec extends it. That's why I was looking for another example. But
okay,
insert
that's off the top of my head.
major mode from GNU ELPA. Yeah, but stuff like that. That's the idea. But it wouldn't only be major modes, I assume. There's going to be some discussion as to what packages we want to add. Currently, it's not certain. It's simply being made decisions on that yet, because we're working on finishing up Emacs 31, and that's where most of the bug fixing efforts are going in right now before we progress to any further developments. But that also includes proposals. That includes proposals as to the preset theme, which I am still interested in reading.
I want to come back to something Prot mentioned in my conversation with him about newcomers, and that is the customized interface versus getting people to the Emacs Lisp directly. And I think, Prot, you were not very keen on customize.
Yeah, basically, if I say it in one sentence, is I think the earlier they get into Emacs Lisp, like seeing it and interacting with it, the better it is for them long term. Granted, I am making the assumption that this is a user that will be there long term, right?
Of course. And this is specifically about the customized UI, right?
Yeah, not the underlying functionality,
because that was something I think in your book. Yeah. I had nothing interesting to say.
Okay, it's great for simple options, like yes, we can check the checkbox or we can select from the drop-down list or whatever, but browsing it is, as you mentioned, overwhelming, the general sense of Emacs being overwhelming, and when you start wanting to do something slightly more sophisticated, like, let's add some more capture templates, then it's challenging for people to do. So I'm wondering whether, in general, we should be, is our general strategy to be guiding people to, yes, customize is there, but really you want to be doing Emacs Lisp as quickly as possible. Let's make it easier for you to get to your init file. Let's make it easier for you to test your init file and not fall apart when you miss a parenthesis and all things like that. Do we want to guide people that way?
In one question, I think the first thing we should distinguish is the idea of a UI the problem, or is it really, because I have a new Emacs configuration at my day job, and I do everything using customize. I don't even, I set all the options using it. I don't even care about using use package or whatever. Just customize the stuff using, there's a big blob of user options which I've modified, and that goes through, and I don't care about it, but I claim to have some understanding what's going on, and the rest of the function is just some defines, which I find convenient. So, but for me, it's okay because I have some sort of a intuition of how the UI, how the customized UI works. If there were a better UI for customize, would you still say that if it were written in an intuitive way, say using FIDO modes, so that it would use interactive narrowing and it would somehow work in a build on existing intuitions, because the current customized the customized UI, the easy customization interface, I think is a technical term it uses, is based around this widget library interface, and sort of replicating a TUI menu, but not, and then you have to have And yeah, of course, the intuition, like if you click on things, it doesn't always behave the same thing you would expect from a regular settings menu, which is, by the way, also something that Kua specifies. I recently looked into what Kua lists as, like if you look at the Wikipedia page, Kua specifies that every application has to have a settings menu with tabs on the bottom and the top where it lists all the options you can specify. And interestingly, Control-C and Control-V is not listed as, apparently not Kua, but Shift Insert and Control Insert. So that's, I might be misunderstanding this, but this seems to be a misnomer. But if we had some sort of a UI like this Kua configuration UI, would that be something where you'd say as an intermediate stage for just setting options? Because that's that was part of my thought process with Emacs configuration generator. Just configuring Emacs is such a subset of Lisp, as it's actually not programming Lisp. You can easily get by just using add hook, set opt or set queue, and add to list or stuff like that. But you don't really have to understand. It's just a peculiar syntax for how to program Lisp. I'm not sure if either of you have seen. I wrote a blog post last March. No, not March. What's the name of the month? November, October or something. Where I gave a prototype for a INI-like configuration syntax. Maybe, Sacha, could you open?
I must have read it, but I don't remember it. Yeah.
You must have read it.
Yeah. Because we always read my feeds, but yeah, now it doesn't ring a bell. Yeah.
Exactly. And you see, there's this basically a simplified syntax, which should, the idea was it should follow more a conventional configuration-like format, and each of these lines gets translated directly to an Emacs Lisp expression. And due to this, I don't want to call it an isomorphism, but the easy translation in both directions, I think that the expectation of saying write Emacs Lisp, you have to write. There has to be some bfun or something if you're writing Emacs Lisp. That's to exaggerate. If you're just writing set up, add hook, add list, these common configuration patterns, which are well worth documenting in the manual to understand, like what are the patterns that you have to use to configure a package, even understanding the distinction between add list and add hook. That hooks are lists which can have mode local extensions, but also inherit from global settings, not obvious from the beginning to everyone. This is not programming. This is not Lisp programming for me.
Yeah, fair enough. Though even then, they start to see the parentheses, get used to the syntax. Like they have to remember to quote stuff, and even though it's not really programming, I see what you're saying.
Yes, but that's what's the value?
They put their, they put themselves in the situation. Yeah.
One of the ideas precisely in this ini config syntax is that like if you have an option like set, you see the first line, set mode, mode line compact long. Long is a symbol. That's read. I just used regular read to read this, and it's not evaluated. There's an option down there somewhere, I think, eval set, where the format expression it's an S expression that's evaluated to a string. So you have to opt into evaluation, which seems more intuitive to me for a regular configuration when you're writing it, because all these things, like I have to think about quoting. Then there's the issue like with eval after load. Can I customize this variable before the package is loaded or after the package is loaded? If it has, like if you're adding something to a list and the list has a default value, then you don't want to set the value of the default, don't want to add it to the list because then it's not loaded and could trigger a undefined variable signal. So these are other inconveniences, and I personally do not see any value in teaching people or having people to deal with these sorts of issues before they have any broader intuition of Lisp, which is a very idiosyncratic take, perhaps, but
no, it's fair. It's fair, of course.
What I'm trying to get is this sort of any configuration syntax would be something that a UI could generate a lot easier, and in a way that would be wouldn't have this artificial split between your own personal handcrafted configuration and the generated part of the configuration. So like mechanically changing this, finding the section package-av, because it has all these primitives which didn't exist early on in Emacs, like packages and yes, features exist and so on. But the sort of structure which use package usually provides.
I have about 1 minute
Could
before
be
Nikito starts on lunch break, so I'm going to interrupt a little bit and do a quick summary. But the two of you are welcome to keep hanging out and chatting. I'll leave the big blue button room open, and if you want, I can set up so people can join you, depending on your time, etc., etc. But basically, what I'm getting from quick summary of the conversation. Emacs 31, it's, the newcomer presets is work in progress. People are definitely open to improvements, ideas, other suggestions for other features. The keto is just running out now. And we'll put the chat in the thing.
Yeah, of course. That's fun.
Yeah. So what happened?
So Sacha has to check with.
I have to. The kiddo's here, so I'm going to. Do you want me to open up the chat to everybody, or do you have other things?
Me, I can stay for another 20 minutes. Just to say, I can stay for another 20 minutes because then I have to take the dog.
Yeah, and Phil. Oh, you have to leave.
I have 20 minutes is fine. No, 20 minutes is fine for me as well.
Okay. So I will put the thing in the chat and people can continue because the kiddo was like, Okay, yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, of course there is the chat going. Let's see. So Sacha, you will link it there. Nice.
So I presume there has been the terrible idea of people watching this.
All right.
Yeah. So this is live.
Yeah. And I can copy the chat thus far since we didn't even get to any other questions. Hang on a second. Where am I even?
I think we can deal with those, right?
It's over there. Plop. Place.
Yeah. Well, eventually to have a discussion and also take questions, eventually you need to have more time, I guess.
Yeah.
But of course, it's a good. Yeah. That's
Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah. Thank you, Sacha. Thank you very much. And of course, the kiddo overrides all. So that thing with the ini, I think it's very promising. I mean, if you flesh that out, because the other thing is, with the ini configuration, because what would be though the fate of what is now added? When you modify something and it adds this. This has been set by custom. Do not touch it, kind of thing. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, you mean the generated user blob. Well, my idea, or if I had the time / motivation / whatever to flesh this out, because currently it works. Currently, it's an actually existing ELSP file which you could use, but I think it would be most interesting if it would be upstreamed. It would sort of be like if you don't have an .el file. Emacs would look for inits.ini file or emacs.ini file or something like that. Then, of course, you can check does the ini file exist or does the el file exist? Probably there would be a user option to select into which it would into which it would inject the new options, and by default it would select. For example, if the ini file exists, then it would use the ini file. But there is some controversy to this because I totally understand the sentiment where you're coming from. With you're using Emacs, so you have to learn Lisp. But for me, the bar is a bit higher than just the inconvenience of writing out this. More or less, it's how does Joel Sussman refer to it? This ritualistic Lisp, which you always have to repeat the same stuff all over again, like with eval after load sets, like add to this, then you have to quote the option in one case, and if you change something in a map, then you don't have to add it. And of course, if you know Lisp, then you know that in one case a key map is the console, so you're actually modifying the rest of the console. That's why you don't need to quote it. But in the other case, you're accessing it via symbols, so you need to quote it. But this is nothing. This is all technical details. There's no necessity in it. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. That's fair. That's fair. Of course.
One thing I wanted to bring up in the discussion when we were talking about reverence was there is, one part of the thing that gave me the motivation to go through with learning Emacs, even though I didn't use the tutorial initially, was sort of a reputation I heard about Emacs and the videos I saw. Wow, you can do these cool things. And this motivation, this image I had of Emacs helped me go through. But if you overshoot this approach, then people expect too much in the beginning and are disappointed in the end, and don't pull through.
Correct. Yeah.
There's this question of having how's it called, the noble lie of how to motivate people enough to be interested in Emacs, to actually learn it, but not to oversell it. In this, like if you give some sort of a demo of using Emacs, which is simply not representative of how it actually works, and that's something which would backfire. But I guess we can take a look at the questions, right? These are Sacha,
let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't read them. I had the chat open, but I didn't have the time to read.
Or are these?
Sorry?
I'm not sure how to parse these. Is this from top to bottom, or what are the number one? Number two,
I guess from top to bottom is how they arrived in the chat. Like the top is the earliest.
Yeah, the usernames are mentioned below. I guess that's a copy paste.
Yeah.
Thing.
Yeah. So there are some.
I gave the kids
okay.
lunch, so I'm back.
Oh, hello there.
We were just wondering about how to read the comments you posted. Maybe you have a better UI?
I pasted them into the chat. So in the big blue button.
Yeah. But that's the order of occurrence?
That's order of occurrence. It's totally not very...
Yeah.
It's just like a big paste.
While you read it, let me... Yeah, there is a comment there from LC2000, about the splash screen having a lot of emphasis on the legal side, which is a fair comment. I think the legal side is important, though, because, of course, free software and all that. But, of course, it could be rearranged. So maybe you don't want to have it at the top, front, and center. You want to have it further down, maybe. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion, but I think the legal side is it should be there at some point.
I feel like this is a political minefield, though. Just leave that alone. Otherwise, we'll have like 200 comments on Emacs Val, one of those really long threads.
I cannot underemphasize how surprised I was when my suggestion to add a checkbox on the splash screen just went through. Because I expected people to object, no, we can't add it there because of some system. It wouldn't look the way it should look, and that would be confusing or whatever. But apparently, change is possible. But you have to be careful and be patient. But of course,
and I guess here there is an assumption, right? Like there is also an assumption that people will attack you or be unreasonable. And I think this is not true. Like you mentioned it earlier as well. Like eventually you have to get on the mailing list because people, if they don't hear the opinion, the counterpoint, they will never know what to do with it.
But it's not entirely unreasonable because there are discussions that can be... There are people on Emacs level, it's sad to admit it, but there are people who voice strong opinions with no power behind them, which can scare people away because there are no tags. Like there's no index of people on Emacs level, so you don't know if some John Doe responding to your message, if he's actually like responsible for this and makes a decision, or if it's if Ellie is sending a message and his decision on the discussion actually weighs a lot more than other matters and other opinions.
Right, which is one of the reasons why I feel like sometimes experimenting with the newbie focused resources, like the unofficial ones that are around, like at least we can try the ideas out and then say, hey, here's the patch, and also here's what people have been using it for, so you can see it a bit more concretely than dropping an idea into the discussion and then having the whole bike shedding happening without as much data.
That's seriously my the main recommendation. If you want to propose something, add a prototype, add a patch, add something to narrow down the discussion. That's something people can take away from this discussion, from my experience.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that's the way to go. Like, just implement something so that it focuses the attention. Otherwise, you will get those endless discussions very quickly.
Or like try it as a
But
package
also
first,
be
and then
patient.
it can be core.
Yeah. Excuse
Sorry.
me?
Oh, I was thinking if it's possible to prototype something as a package, now that Emacs has made it a lot easier for people to install packages, then at least it can be tested before having all the conversation about whether it should be as part of core or as part of the splash screen or everything else.
The counter tendency I feel obliged to mention is that many times proposing something as a package or as an extension to the core can actually simplify the implementation vastly. Especially if you need to make one or two twists upstream and you need some things like an additional hook or something to exist upstream. That's if it's a package in the core, then it's a lot easier to explain why you have to make this change. Having to deal with some sort of advice and changing a lot of things. There was a certain tendency during the mid-2010s, which I only know from history logs, to re-implement a lot of stuff in logs, in packages, instead of working on them upstream. And that created a lot of divergence between packages and complicated, in my opinion, complicated things because it introduces this entire choice fatigue. Should I use flymate? Should I use flycheck? Should I use LSP mode? Should I use egglot, which is not a historically accurate example in the setting I'm giving, but I'm certainly in favor of at least considering upstream contributions, even like packages. Of course, it's the way we recently published these guidelines, or not guidelines, this contribution guide to publishing packages on ELPA, which is on, if you want to open it in the browser, it's on the ELPA homepage. Which lists sort of these hard criteria which we require from ELPA. Just elpagnu.org. Yeah, it's that's going to be a link to the page.
Yeah, this was pretty recent.
This is recent, and then there's a list of like suggestions. But this is getting off the actual point. I'm just saying that relating to the general point. My experience is that proposing something concrete, but also be open to hearing the opinions of other people. These are the two necessary, but maybe not always sufficient ingredients to making, to changing stuff. Because if you just say, I want this to be different, but don't put in the work, then everyone's going to forget it. But if you propose something and then insist that it has to be exactly this way, then you're just creating social tension.
All right.
Maybe missing out on interesting things.
And especially since people are using Emacs for so many different reasons and coming from so many different backgrounds, what you are very firmly committed to might very well work for one set of people, but will run into these issues for all these other people. So if we want to bring it back to this, how do we make the newcomer experience better? It's great that in core there's starting to be a little bit more infrastructure for supporting things like sets of reasonable defaults for people, and maybe we as a community need to figure out, all right, how do we write documentation around it, how do we make tutorial videos, how do we encapsulate, okay, this is what this typical newcomer experience is like for this set of people, and maybe these options or packages or glue code might be helpful for this group.
Maybe.
Yeah, like in theory, you can imagine of something like, if you are a Python developer, here is your Python presets theme. If you are doing org or whatever, here is your LaTeX and friends, right? And you could also have extensions like that in the future.
And mean, nothing about the idea is it could also be user as a package. People can load otherwise, and hopefully, as I said, there is certainly additional work which can be put into making user option themes more better supported. I think one of the things that will be useful is actually referring to them just in nomenclature points as user option themes to distinguish them
from themes.
From color themes, yeah.
Color themes, yeah. That's there.
Yeah.
We even introduced the distinction. Themes have kinds since like Emacs 29 or 8.
29,
or
I
like
think. 29.
29.
Yeah.
That was actually
I think you
that was
did
where
that,
this
right?
idea already started. I think I worked in the patch, but that was exactly. I mean, that was already where the seeds for the current theme were started, because we wanted to distinguish between these different kinds of themes. Were there any other questions?
I don't think so. But yeah, as we saw now with the find library that Sacha did in the beginning, it would be nice to also eventually be able to find the theme or whatever. Maybe it's a different find theme if for whatever reason it cannot be find library.
Not imagine a reason why that shouldn't be the case. I mean, you could just extend the logic to not only not only consider the load or a load list, but also the whatever the variable is for the list, and it should be able to find that as well, even though it's strictly speaking not a library. But that's a decision that someone has to make at some point, or convince someone that their
I think find
opinion is
library
right.
does work for it. Like find library will find it only if it's loaded, and then since I can't like undo
if it's a package.
Yeah. All right,
If you install it as a package, yes.
Because then the theme is in a directory which package-el has added to the load list. I think the preset, if my memory serves me correct, then find library only looks through load path.
I see. And etc. themes is not in the load path.
Exactly, because this is. I don't know why. It's not.
Okay, all right.
So
that's another message to Emacs as well. Yeah.
Technicality.
Yeah. But yeah, that sounds like fun.
But it's a sort of annoyance which from my perspective is so inconvenient that I forget it every time, and then you don't change it.
Branglo says that Doom Emacs module system is very module approach is very nice for beginners and entices them to get into things more. People interested in a certain common set of functionality can get an opinionated starting point in Emacs rather than worrying about what to install. And someone else in the previous someone in the
That's
previous,
sort of like the theme approach, isn't it?
Sort of, yeah. And there's also like all the, it's not just, hey, these are the packages and you can comment and uncomment lines that load the different modules, but also, here's the glue to sort of start to make some of them work better together or to change them to reasonable defaults. I was wondering, actually along those lines, any thoughts about making your configuration generator type thing in Emacs?
The reason in the configuration generator, I did not implement it in Emacs was precisely due to if it were in Emacs, it would use, for example, something like the widget library, and there would be these fine UI discrepancies which people wouldn't expect to behave the way they do. Then scrolling doesn't behave exactly the way they expect it to do. But there has been an idea, I think, when I mentioned the configuration generator the first time. There was the notion of having actually a shared file format behind it, just some F expression, which could be loaded by both the configuration generator and a generic configuration wizard, which could also be used, like every package could define their own configuration wizard for asking the user selected options and configuring these. And that's also something, another thing in Emacs 32, which I plan to work on, is to extend the package archive format. Among other things, allowing for multiple packages to be listed in it, because ELPA, GNU ELPA and non-GNU ELPA both store multiple versions of all packages, but you can only install the most recent one. That's why pinning doesn't work. Absolutely no technical reason why this shouldn't also list other versions as well. And then you could have pinning without having to use Git for packages as well. And there are a few other, there was a thread, I think, earlier this year, where I collected a number of these extensions for the archive format, which could be extended. And now I forgot my now I lost my thread of thought.
But basically extending package.el and the archive, yeah.
Specifically the archive, so that's
showing the previous versions which are already listed, like you said.
Yeah, and so that you could pin the version, so you could install the version. And I honestly do not remember what I was saying just a few seconds ago, which is embarrassing.
It's another problem. Things happen. No worries.
We were talking about Doom Emacs. And
no, there was a comment about the Doom Emacs and specifically the fact that there are these modules and you can load the module without thinking specifically about the packages. But then Sacha told you about your package configurator, like wizard, whatever.
Package configurator wizard, and then if extending the metadata could also include this sort of configuration options, so that packages in some sense could specify what options the user would primarily be interested in, or in what order they should be traversed, and you have some sort of dependency. Of course, this is some effort which has to be put in, but it's not something that's unreasonable from a technical perspective from implementing this. And it would make, I think, it could make, if you have the infrastructure for that, that would make installing and using packages a lot nicer in many cases. But
it sounds very promising for sure.
The UI question remains the thing. Do you want to reuse the customized UI, which has its historical warts? Of course, can they be ironed out? That's a different question. But or do you reinvent something from scratch? And I'm usually not that big of a fan of reinventing UI. Yeah. I'm more in the reuse existing interfaces and just implement backends.
Plus, if you were to invent a new UI, you wouldn't have this new feature ready, like because you have too many things that you need to implement. Whereas just using custom UI allows you to just implement the feature, and then the interface, maybe it's something that somebody else will work on, or you work on at a later.
But then, I mean, but then, of course, that's even if that is the case, then you have to make sure that you don't make assumptions that depend on your own customized. So in the future, it could be it's a whole
fair, yeah.
List of dependencies, which gets complicated.
That sounds like a newcomers presets to unwartify customize, a reset theme to put the warts back on as needed. And then we can use the slightly more modern interface for the things that we had wanted it to do maybe 2 or 3 years down the line.
Maybe something like that. It's all long-term planning with Emacs.
We're coming. We're coming.
But I think just to say this, but of course, everything we have covered thus far, always we have to state it. Newcomers with an asterisk, right? With the caveat that you still have to put in the work, read the manual, be patient, all that, right?
Yes. And we're coming.
Ideally,
go ahead.
Ideally, of course, that's a different discussion.
Ideally, it would be nice if you could even start without it. I mean, I started without it, but it took me 3 or 4 years to actually write Lisp then. Because that's also, I mean, I didn't want to write defun. I thought, I don't write my own functions. I just want to set options, which was wrong. And appealing to this, that was the point from the beginning. But I think, Sacha, you wanted to close the discussion.
I just wanted to acknowledge that we are coming up in the 20 minutes that you said you were available for. I need to go. The dogs and everything. I wanted to
I have to take them for a walk because I have a meeting afterwards. Yeah.
Right. I wanted to thank both of you. I really like this conversation and the heads up and the interesting things coming down the pipeline. So thank you for that. We're going to continue, I think, working on the user experience for newcomers, which will probably be a mix of documentation and packages and other experiments, and occasional email to Emacs Devel suggesting things like the find-user-init-file and whatever. But thank you so much to you and to everyone who's tuned in.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you for hosting everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prot, for your
comments. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Where do we close from here? Okay, that's the red button.
I just want to ask the second question. I'm just going to close the tab. Bye.